Hello, my
Hello.
name is Jen Sunshine here with my dear friend and longtime creative partner David Ng, and together we are the co-artistic directors of Love Intersections, a media arts collective that produces intersectional and intergenerational film and artwork from underrepresented communities. We're also founding members of the Vancouver Artists Labor Union Cooperative, also known as Value Co-op, which is an artist-run worker cooperative whose goal is to provide flexible living wage income to artists. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we are gathered here today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Part of our work as labor activists and queer artists on unceded territories means working in solidarity with ongoing Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, decolonization, reparations, and land back. Hotbot Talks emerged during the pandemic from our collaboration with the Lim Association in Chinatown, historically a neighborhood of Chinese railroad laborers who were brought to settle Indigenous territories as part of the ongoing colonial project.
So why Hotpot Talks? As Jen mentioned, Value Co-op it has a studio in the Lim Sai Hor Khao Mak Association building in Chinatown. And when we moved into that studio, had long conversations about the role that artists have played in gentrifying the neighborhood. And we're really intentional about building reciprocal relationships with the neighborhood and to the broader community as well. Value Co-op has a no surpluses, no kickbacks model, where all of our surpluses are redirected into community projects that serve the community or to employ artists. And so over the past 2 years, we've been collaborating with the Lim Association on a project to digitize their archives and create a series of artworks that invites people to learn and engage with their positionality to Chinatown and Chinatowns as a theme. With the increased conversations about anti-Asian racism recently, the past 2 years have brought to the surface already existing yellow peril narratives, re-emerging again during the pandemic. We've seen Chinatowns and elders targeted by racial violence and vandalism. We've seen the rise of Boba Liberal organizing around hashtag Stop Asian Hate demands for hate crime legislation, which is pro-police, pro-surveillance, and harms Black and Indigenous communities. We've seen gentrification eating away at the souls of Chinatowns and other BIPOC communities, seemingly with no end in sight. This season, we'll touch on themes of diaspora, xenophobia, systemic racism, intersectional solidarity, building, and Chinatown futurities.
Before we introduce our guest today, I want to thank our incredible team, Ava and Cameron, behind the scenes who help make Hotbot Talks a reality. I'm so excited to introduce our guest. Rita Wong is a poet scholar who attends to the relationships between water justice, ecology, and decolonization. She has co-edited an anthology with Dorothy Christian entitled Downstream, Reimagining Water, based on a gathering that brought together elders, artists, scientists, writers, scholars, students, and activists around the urgent need to care for the waters that give us life. An associate professor in critical and cultural studies at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, Wong has also served her faculty association as a steward and president. Rita works to support Indigenous communities' efforts towards justice and health for water, having witnessed such work at the Peace River, the Wedzin Kwa Ferry Creek, the Columbia River, the Fraser River, the Salish Sea, and the Arctic Ocean watershed. She understands that when these waterways are healthy, life, including people, will be healthy too, and that we cannot afford to endanger and pollute the waters that sustain our lives. Welcome, Rita.
Hi, Rita.
Hello, thank you for having me on your show.
Maybe Rita, you're on sabbatical right now. Maybe we'll start with how has the sabbatical been? What have you been up to?
Well, in theory, I'm working on a book of essays around waterways that I've visited and spent time with and tried to protect. But I have to say I've been very busy with the union work this semester, and it hasn't been much of a sabbatical, unfortunately. That said, I did manage to get up to the Unistoten Healing Center for a couple of weeks in the snow back in February, and was able to spend some time up there. In the biogen, you mentioned the Wedzin Kwa. That's a river that is so clean you can drink right out of it. You don't need to
Wow.
chlorinate it or treat it or anything. And I just felt so grateful to live, even briefly, in a place where you can still do that. That's what the
Wow.
Wet'suwet'en people have been protecting for many, many, many generations.
That's so rare. This is immediately making me think my partner and I are kind of slowly preparing over time, gathering emergency supplies and materials. And the one thing that's on our wish list is those wands that you can place in water to filter out the water so that they're drinkable.
Oh,
And because it's just it's just unheard of for like clean drinking water, and we're kind of doomsday, preparing for our unforeseeable future. So
it's
just
good to prepare.
Yeah. I'm wondering, maybe we can just, because this going into this topic, I wonder if we can just like kind of dive right in because, Jen, this thinking about doomsday, I mean, we just noticed the hail and this very like
Yeah.
tumultuous
Yep.
weather that we've been having.
Thunder.
I'm wondering, because one of the things that I've been thinking about is like, and last year I'm thinking about, the heat dome, right? And then
Yeah.
everyone's panicking about buying air conditioners, right? And thinking
Hmm.
about preparing for emergency supplies. And so and one of the things I've been trying to undo in my brain is also just preparing for the like emergency, which I also need to do, Jen. Thank you for the reminder. But also what are the pieces that need to be sort of undone in my life that are contributing to these crises as
Yeah.
well. I'm wondering because I guess I mean I don't know if I have a full question about this, but like Rita, when just in this couple minutes of hearing this initial conversation about, I mean, reading your bio and thinking about when we have healthy waterways, we have healthy life too.
Hmm.
How
Hmm.
I'm how did you come around to not just recognizing but also like enacting that in your activism, recognizing that there's actually yeah I'll leave it there.
That's a great question, David. And I think maybe it comes from the sense of being proactive rather than reactive. Like the
Mm,
emergency's hit and we're in it already, but there's still a lot that can be done to prevent it from getting worse.
yeah.
And so, I had spent time, for example, last summer up at Fairy Creek, where folks have been trying to protect old growth forests. And those trees, like, they're so enormous. They're like, the size of this apartment room that I'm in. And they create their own weather. They create
Yeah.
rain.
Wow.
They're a force of nature, basically. And it is an act of stupidity and I think it's criminal negligence to be
Yeah.
cutting down these ecosystems that we really, really need intact, not just locally, but globally.
Mm,
And I came to this journey in a sort of circuitous way because I grew up in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory, homelands of the Tsuut'ina, Siksika, and Stoney First Nations, quite disconnected from that history. Like, I didn't know back then that my family and I were drinking from the Bow River.
Mm.
Basically, it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I kind of like, "Oh, okay, that's where our water comes from, and
mm,
that's where our
mm,
wastewater goes," and you start to see yourself as part of this hydrological cycle that,
mm,
you're actually in, you're not separate from it, and, I have a lot of friends to thank for that journey, Dorothy Christian, who I co-edited, that Downstream anthology I mentioned, she, many years ago, with her friend Denise, organized an event called Protect Our Sacred Waters. And the vision of that gathering was to bring together people from all four directions for the sake of water.
mm,
That now is the time to work together, or it's going to be very, very bad for all of us.
mhm,
So learning to cooperate and come together and to know what gifts we carry and how to share them is, I think, how I started on this. And then Dorothy and I, at that time, Dorothy made that call, and I was actually in Florida teaching at the University of Miami for a little while, and I
mm,
wasn't able to attend, but I decided to take up her invitation in a really long-term way. Like, I developed a course around contemplating water. I applied for a fellowship and spent some time developing that course. And since then, it's just been this journey of like paying attention, showing up where the water is, and just listening, a lot
mm,
of listening and trying to share what you learn.
mm.
Rita, I'm so curious, and this is just like I'm so glad that we're having this conversation and that I can actually like talk to you in person. Because when when I was in my 20s, becoming more involved in activism in the community, I've only ever heard of. It was so rare for me to hear like Asian names and in activism. And so, the few that I heard, you being one of them, Rita Wong, Lai Wan, and Larissa Lai. It was so rare for me to see kind of people that look like me, that share kind of a racial or ethnicity background, involved in such a kind of visible way. So I'm curious about what your observations has been over the decades of organizing, in terms of what was it like organizing when you were younger versus your observations of how people organize now?
Yeah, well, growing up in Calgary, I didn't move to Vancouver until the mid 90s, but I felt very much that sense of kind of a hunger to see other Asian faces involved in these things too. Absolutely.
Hmm.
And when we were growing up in Calgary, Hiromi Goto,
Yeah.
myself, Suzanne Yi, and some other folks, we were part of a Women of Color collective.
Oh.
And in Calgary, you have to understand that this is quite different than in Vancouver. I mean, this is also in the 90s, so I guess, it's like a few decades ago. Oh my God, that sounds really old. Um, and we were similarly looking around, and for us, we were
Yeah.
looking at like Sky Lee, for instance, her novel *Disappearing Moon Cafe*.
Mm-hmm.
Jam Ismail, who's an amazing poet that more people should be aware of. Lily Shinde, for instance. Like
Yes.
there's a generation and many generations before us, but I feel like every generation we have to kind of go out and look for them and try to find them, right, and track them
Mm,
down and spend time with them.
mm,
And so we were lucky that Lee Miracle came and did a
mm,
workshop with us in Calgary. This is like the early mid 90s. And Lee basically, I think that one workshop, it was just like 1 day workshop, but it really put me on the path that I'm on today. Lee was so generous, and she just had this way of being really kind of forthright. She's like, you're living through war, and there's sort of this polite pretense in Canadian society that you're not. But
mhm.
colonization, for Lee's family and for many Indigenous families, the apocalypse has been happening already, right?
Yeah.
It's been going on for generations and generations. And I think what Lee taught me, and there's so many things, but she shared with us like a history of solidarity, of relationships that had existed between Asian and Indigenous peoples, for instance, that
Mm,
wasn't documented, wasn't told, but there was a mutual kind of aid that had happened, that still is important today, I would say.
mm,
And I also, when I was in Calgary, my first book of poetry was called Monkey Puzzle, and my editor
mm,
for that was Claire Harris. Claire's a African Canadian poet who's now passed, sadly. But Claire actually warned me. She said, "Don't let them call you an activist, because then they'll just dismiss you, or you have
mm.
to do all the work and they don't." And it was good advice, but I couldn't really take it. like I kind of always felt like, well, whatever people call you, they call you. Like we have to find ways to find each other somehow.
Yeah.
But like I did take her warning to heart in the sense that what we do is
Mm-hmm.
basically like practical stuff, and everybody should be doing it, you
Yes.
know.
Mm,
Um,
Yes.
so just I guess maybe to think about it as a way of picking up the work that needs doing, whatever
Mm-hmm.
that happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
mm,
I mean, I see so many different kind of synonyms, or like euphemisms around that is around the word activist, right? There's organizer, convener,
mhm.
facilitator. Yeah, there's just all these different words, that you can take on. But I've always found a kind of power in naming and embodying. It is
Yeah.
activism. We are
And
activists.
it's interesting because I had this conversation I think last week at because I'm also doing a PhD right now, and there's an emphasis in well, there's been conversations and sort of that have been emerging about the fact that we're obviously academics, and there's now this new emphasis in my program to around art, but what about the activism?
Mhm.
And I'm
Mhm.
curious, it's interesting because it seems to be different institutions that kind of want to push that down and no, 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 focus on like the intellectual, quote unquote, the intellectual stuff or the artistic stuff, and don't sort of stir the pot with your weird Marxist activism.
Yeah. I think it's good to reclaim it, but I think, like all terms have their sort of limits, I guess. It's how
Yeah.
they get deployed and how they get received. That
Yeah,
maybe is the question. Yeah.
I mean, it
yeah,
does get co-opted as well.
yeah.
So I always am very careful depending on the context, and when I hear other people, and especially in spaces where, and we can talk about this later in terms of the corporatization of spaces, but I do see, different corporations using the language, like our language, if I can say that,
Absolutely.
as like a weapon, and they
Mhm.
weaponize it, and then yeah, it just is
Yeah. It's so
unfortunate.
upsetting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good, this has come up in a couple episodes where, do we counter the co-optation or do we find new language? Because I often get frustrated that like, how do we, we're always being put on this, like needing to find new, redefine something because the police are now trying to take transformative justice, that type of language. The corporations are taking climate justice language, for example. Yeah, I'm
Mhm.
curious,
Or they're
Rita, what are you?
taking
Yeah,
they're doing the equity, diversity, and inclusion, the EDI,
yeah,
right? Is
Oh,
yeah,
now
yeah.
totally corporate.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's so corporatized, it's
Yeah.
really upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, don't get me
yeah.
started on that. Oh boy. Um, yeah, I don't know, like I feel like when they use that language, you have to try to hold them accountable to it, but it's such a Herculean task, you know?
Yeah,
Like, yeah. Um,
yeah.
and it's so frustrating. Well, like, I don't know. I mean, even terms like queer, right? Those were people taking those terms back. And
Mm,
I think there's value in holding on to the terms that have served you, right? And honoring those words.
mm,
So I don't know. I think it depends on the context too.
mm,
But yeah. But I wanted to circle back for a second before I forget.
mm.
And it was that Lee Miracle had organized a gathering of Asian and Indigenous writers when she was visiting writer at I think it was Western Washington University in Bellingham. That's how Dorothy and I met and got
Oh.
to meet each other and work in a very long way, over many years now. And like just the attending to making spaces for us to gather and to like not be under the white gaze and to just
Mm,
be able to speak frankly and to take the time to build relations and get to know each other, like that is so important.
mm, mm,
um so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And Lee passed last year, and I know she's
yeah.
missed by many of us.
Yes.
But yeah, I just when I think about all the generosity that she had, because Lee had every reason to be angry, and I think we do too. And
Mm,
anger can be powerful, as Audre Lorde and others have written, but it can also have its limits. And so to try to work from a place of love, like as you obviously know, with love intersections, I think that
mhm,
that is really important. Like to of the range of places that we could be coming from, to come from that place is really important, and Lee
mm,
did that very, very well, I would say. Even though
mm.
people counter confrontational, I just thought she was always just very frank and to the point.
Oh, totally, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
badass.
Yeah.
I'm wondering because it's becoming, and I'm speaking from experience, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to organize, and I think that for a large part of it is due to the pandemic having changed the entire landscape of how we organize in person,
Mhm.
because now we have to navigate the hybridity of virtual and in person. So I'm wondering what your projection or what your observation or insight is in terms of how groups can organize, and I'm saying this because David and I have to prepare in different plan Bs in terms of how we organize like a symposium, whether that's navigating, okay, there's a possibility for cancellation, or just having to have all of these different backup plans in order to, because and sometimes people just don't even show up. So that's been something we've had challenges around. I don't know, David, did you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. I think it's something that is something that I think about too. Like, obviously when we had to, and I hate the word pivot, but when we had to pivot, so Hot Pot Talks was originally, it grew out of a cancellation of the exhibit that we were supposed to do with the Lim Association. And so we wanted to, how do we continue these conversations about colonialism, Chinatowns, intersectionality and those things, you know, continue them in a way that we, with folks out, even though we can't do this exhibit. But I'm also thinking, Jen, despite I'm thinking about all of the movements that have also been galvanized over the past 2 years, like really, really I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, land back to an extent as well, really, really. And I'm thinking about all the statues toppling, and there's debates around the symbolism of that and not the actual what's material changes as well. But I'm also just thinking so much has also happened just in spite of being isolated.
It's
And
true.
I know I don't know if I'm sort of steering away from, because you're talking specifically about organizing digital
On the
versus in
ground.
person.
Well, and
But there's some
on the ground.
but there's something there, like there's been there's been a big energy as well in spite of the
Probably
separation
because
too.
we were all home and paying attention to what's going
And
on
pissed off.
globally.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's these are such good questions, and I don't know that I have a great answer, but I would say that um, there was something that Lee wrote in one of her stories, Goodbye Snoke, which is find freedom, find freedom in the context you inherit, and that we're built for transformation.
Mm,
Um, and I would say that it has been very tiring, kind of living with the anxiety and the instability of COVID. At the same time, I think that, it presents a real call to um, organize on a massive scale in terms of um, both climate uh, crisis, but also in terms of, I guess, mutual care. And the, you know, one of the things that I think I found in the pandemic was that I'm a fairly introverted person and I can handle a lot of isolation just fine. I actually don't suffer for that very much. But what
Yeah,
I
same.
have trouble with is, you know, uh, the sense of time shifting and the scale kind of getting all wonky, I guess, a little bit. And
mm,
so, so it feels things are dispersed. Like, so you didn't have your exhibition, but now you're having these prolonged conversations over many years, you
yeah.
Yes.
know, and
Many
it's less
years.
legible. It's less legible in one way,
Yeah.
but more legible in another way, right? Depending on how you're
Yeah.
looking at it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't know, like I think the good thing is that there's a record for us to go back to and kind of build on. But at the same time, it makes us easily surveyed and tracked too, because it's
Yeah.
Yes.
everything's online.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, I would say.
Mm,
But
mm.
that said, there's still a lot you can and have been doing, I think, with these conversations. I did watch a few of them and really enjoyed them, by the way.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
yeah, yeah. Um, and um, the logistical challenges that you were raising, like, I don't know, there's not much, to do with that except to maybe learn to be compassionate with each other
Hmm.
around it. Like yesterday, I was biking around to stop by something to pick up some soup from a business where one of my former students works, and it was closed because of illness, and like there's more and more of that kind of stuff, and that
Yeah.
seems unusual in a Canadian context, but it's not unusual in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
you know. I lived in China for a year teaching English in the early 90s, and stuff is not always predictable, and you just kind of learn to roll with it.
Mm.
So it creates, like, I think, a different sense of time. Like, there's something about colonized time that's like everything's got to be
Yeah.
really precise, really
Yeah.
reliable, like German trains or Japanese trains, like that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like the rest of us are like, whenever we show up is the right time. Whoever
Yes.
shows up
Yeah.
are the right people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it means, like, just kind of loosening up a little bit in terms of our own timelines and our own rubrics and our own
Mm.
expectations of ourselves, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do appreciate. I lurk a lot on different forums and pay attention to what people are reading and saying on the ground. And one of the observations that I've noticed that we've become more increasingly the conversations are becoming more increasingly about anti-work and not having a 5-day, 40-hour kind of work week and what that actually means. And I think the pandemic really kind of put the spotlight on that because we were all of a sudden able to work from home when so many disability activists have been talking about this and making things virtual, making things accessible for so long, and then all of a sudden when able people and able bodies are experiencing this hardship, that's when all these accessible tools became available to us. So yeah.
I feel very mixed about it because I, on the one hand, appreciate the digital access, but on the other hand, I still feel very suspicious of technology. I
Yeah.
just can't help it. It's
Yes,
built into
it's
me.
not uncommon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I have such gripes with it as well in terms of, which corporations I have to shell out money for. And they
yeah,
make older, models obsolete because it forces us to buy newer models and newer
yeah.
adapters. That to me is just, is a terrible, terrible thing. Sorry, David, you were going to say
No,
something.
I wanted to ask because we were talking about time, I know, Rita, you mentioned you haven't been an archivist for a while, but we've been talking about sort of you were referencing like memory as well, and thinking
Mhm.
about referencing generations that have come prior. Um, can you tell me a little bit about how that has played into your work? Or you've mentioned sort of the your work with Lee Miracle, but I'm just thinking I don't know much about what the archiving work that you were doing, yeah,
Sure.
and how it plays into your
Yeah.
your work.
Yeah. So I did my undergrad in English literature at the University of Calgary years ago, and then I went and taught in Japan for a year, came back here, did a master's degree at the University of Alberta, and then went overseas and taught in China for a year, and then came back here. And when I was living in Calgary, I decided to apply to study to become an archivist. So that's what actually brought me to Vancouver initially, was the archival studies program at UBC. And I also was really interested in connecting with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop in Vancouver, like, because I was in Calgary, which is at that time very white, and I was really
Mm,
curious about what was going on in Vancouver and really hungry for a sense of Asian community, right?
Yeah.
And writing and creative community in particular. And so I did learn how to become a professional archivist. I did, like, write a organizational profile of success many many years ago as a assignment for one of my classes. Also the Chinese Canadian Library Society, also the Umista Cultural Center up in Alert Bay. So I did various projects just because I was interested in community memory.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And then I was also at the same time eventually working at the Delta Museum of and Archives as an archivist. And then we went on strike for 4 months and were locked out. And that experience was pretty formative for me in the sense that I came back into a workplace that was very toxic. And I basically said, I still care about these things, but I need to move on. So I applied
mm,
for a scholarship, and I was lucky that I got one, and I ended up going to do doctoral studies at SFU, focusing on Asian Canadian culture production. And my supervisor was Roy Miki, and
mm,
Roy was a great supervisor. He was like, just do what you want to do, like, and I was coming at it as an adult, so I had a lot of I think, support to study whatever I wanted to study. And I spent much of
Mm,
my doctoral studies actually organizing with a group called DARE, Direct Action Against Refugee Exploitation.
mm,
That was formed partly through a lot of relationships that had already built through the queer Asian community. So there was a group called Monsoon of Asian bisexual and lesbian women that was active at the time or just before DARE formed. And so when 4 ships of migrant people from China arrived on these shores, we already kind of knew each other and we had networks that we could just organize, right? And
mm,
so we had meetings, we had surprising turnout of people, a lot of support. And so we started going into the prisons to visit the women. We were sort of ad hoc translators at one point because the
Yeah.
prison system
mm,
was not set up for any of this. And we, out of 600 people on 4 ships, there were about 90 or so women. And at that time, the prison in Burnaby was still open, the Burnaby Correctional Center for Women. So
mm,
we would go in there on a weekly basis. If women had refugee hearings and things like that, we would accompany them or observe or try to support them. If they actually got out of jail, we would try to connect them to housing and just like very sort of basic kind of support needs. But we weren't just sort of there to be a social service agency because we were all doing this off the side of our desks.
Yeah.
mhm,
Volunteer, ad hoc, because nobody knew this was happening and we
Yeah.
weren't prepared for any of it, but we just had to respond. And
mm,
so we also did a report basically looking at making recommendations about how you shouldn't criminalize migrants and undocumented people, not just Asians, but lots of people from
Yeah.
different parts of the world, of course.
yeah,
And, you know, tried to advocate for a less classist, less exclusionary immigration system.
right.
And unfortunately, things I think got worse, not better. But we did try to bring a systemic lens to it,
Mm,
and a lens informed by how many of the people that were displaced were partly in relationship to Western narratives of progress being imposed overseas. So
mhm,
example, there was a woman who was displaced because the farm that she had lived in, was being plowed under for an airport, stuff like that, right? And so this model of Western so-called development
Yeah.
is
right.
basically driving us to the brink of mass extinction. Like
Mm,
Yes.
it's not a sustainable model,
mm,
and it's displacing, millions of people. So that was, I think, how I got into it in Vancouver, just
mm,
through different networks and people kind of responding to things as they happen. Because when the folks arrived on these shores, the racism in the newspapers was
Yeah.
kind of horrific. It was
Yeah.
stuff
yeah,
like "go home" and like just really inhumane. Not thinking about what would drive people to get on a boat,
Yes.
like get on this really dangerous voyage and like risk their lives to come here. There was very little corporate media that
right.
was, even vaguely sympathetic. Yeah.
Mm, yeah, yeah. This topic of archiving, and Jen and I have been actually just over the past few weeks been thinking about that because, and this came up for me because in my because honestly during my comprehensive exams my supervisory committee was like where are you placing your work in the genealogy of other
Oh,
BIPOC artists who have been doing anti-racist work, and as I've been talking to folks in like the quote unquote previous generation that have been also been doing this type of work, like David Garneau and Zool Solomon and Richard Fung, who's on my committee, Dana Claxon, they keep bringing up, for example, like Minchon Panchayat.
yeah. Minkwon Pachaya. Yep.
Yeah, and I was like, and when I read other conundrums, I was like, oh my goodness, like these battles like that were or these fights have been happening forever.
Ever.
That's right. They have.
And so I
Yeah.
think about like, anyways, it has been on the back of my mind because the what we're organizing against right now, um, trying to think of a
Has.
way that becomes archived so that,
Yeah.
and making sure that we sort of keep sharing that so
Hmm.
that those yeah those archives continue, are kept somewhere.
Yeah, like when I first started, I forgot to say this earlier. I was really like I first met Larissa at a conference for writers of color that was held by the Writers Union in Ontario. It's a cultural thing. It was called. Oh, sorry, not it's a cultural thing. The Appropriate Voice. There've been so many
Uh,
conferences. It's a cultural thing did happen, but it was in Calgary, and that's where I met Kage and Laiwan actually. And they were like, "Oh my goodness, people from Vancouver!" It was very
yeah,
exciting.
yeah.
And yeah, so like I actually like did a lot of work looking for other Asian Canadian writers, like of anything, right? Like, and you go into the archives and you look for it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a book called Chinese Women of America. It's a photo book by
Mm,
Judy Young, and there was a story in that book that really kind of resonated for me, and it was um, a woman named so-called China Annie. Like they didn't actually ever use their real Chinese names in the like if you even got a newspaper clipping, which was rare, but if you even got that, right, you get China Mary or China Annie or China whatever, right? You didn't
Right.
actually get their real names
wow.
bothered
Yeah.
to learn them. But there was this comment that she ran away and stole herself, like that she stole
Hmm.
her life back. And that always stuck with me, the sense of having to steal your life back from all the forces that would take it away from you.
Mm,
Yes.
mm, mm, mm.
So
Oh,
I
I
like
love that.
there's a lot of that in the history if you look for
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Rita, I want to ask about your poetry. Can you tell me a little bit about your practice? I read an article about you somewhere that talked about sort of your how your activism and practice is intertwined. And many of your books, we started this conversation talking about water. Um,
The
are
theme is very. The theme is of water is throughout your poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I mean, this is also, Jen and I are not poets or writers by any means, but I'm curious about how your activism and arts practice yeah, come together.
Yeah. I think I th- I think about the poetry as kind of leading me to what needs doing.
Hmm.
So in my first book of poetry, Monkey Puzzle, there's a section in it that comes from time I spent living in China. And when I was in China teaching English, I also did a trip along the Yangtze River, and I was opposed to the Three Gorges Dam, which had not been completed yet at that point. And I find
Wow.
myself kind of coming full circle now, opposing the Site Sea Dam in BC
Yes.
for similar reasons, like the displacement of people, of land, the destruction of like incredible cultural history, all these things that are being devalued for the sake of profit, basically, that isn't actually sustainable. Anyway, so it was kind of like the poetry led me to what needed doing. Like once you say
Hmm.
something, you kind of have to live by what you said.
Right.
So like opposing the dam, for instance, like I came back and I was like talking to, I think it was Ming Pao, or like just kind of trying to live by where the words had led you.
Hmm.
And I think poetry is important for me as a lifeline, as a way of trying to articulate what needs to be done, but it's not the same as doing it, right?
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
needs to be in conjunction with people, with communities, with economics, with social issues, etc. And so people will often say, "Oh, your poetry is a form of activism," and it is, but it isn't.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
it is in this realm, but not in this other realm. And
Yeah.
I was on a retreat for burnt out activists many years ago, and there was a sense that there's sort of three things that need to happen. One is a sense of protecting the gains that previous generations have made, that kind of reactive work. I see the union work as kind of like that in that realm, right?
Yeah.
And that
Hmm.
work is important, like housekeeping, but it's not going to be enough by itself, and it can really burn you out.
Yes.
You also need a systemic analysis of how the system's working and where you can put pressure points and change things. And then you actually need to build the things that you want, or, make
Hmm.
them come into place. And so I think of the creative work more in that third realm, although it can operate in other realms too.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, just to try to figure out where to put your energy can be a tough call sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think Jen and I have had this conversation too. In some of the stuff that we've been trying to explore too, like we might not really know how to articulate it in our work yet, but like in our art practice, making a film about it. Like I'm thinking, Jen, about Yellow Peril, Queer
Mm-hmm.
Destiny, for example. There was so much about like, and it's funny. We're filming a sequel to it, or not a sequel, a follow up. And at the time, in 2018, when we conceived it and we shot it and released it in 2019, we were thinking about a queer Asian futures, and
Okay.
not sort of fully sort of figured out.
Understanding what that means, even at the time.
And then now, fast forward
Figure it
after
out as
this,
you go. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
we figured it out as it go. And then once we sort of made the film, and then now it's kind of taken on a new life in a way, just because of the racial politics of pandemic times. So it's kind of this kind of like, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, that I'm what I'm resonating with is this sort of like
Mm-hmm.
what comes first is not necessarily so linear in terms of activism and
Mm-hmm.
practice. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Rita, I wanted to ask you just before we leave this point. You talked about you touched on labor organizing, and I'm wondering if you said something around the lines of the reactive part as being really important in terms, or I think reactive organizing as being important, and labor being a part of that work. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure. Okay, so let me step back a little bit and say unions are really important, and I'm glad we have them, and we need more of them. But I have actually, at the fundamental level, a sort of unease or an ambivalence about the paradigm. And
Mm,
because when I was trained as a steward, to listen to people's complaints, to file grievances, to try to get, remedies for situations, I was also taught at that point that, like, there's a pie kind of, and your collective agreement when you negotiate one as a union is like takes a slice out of that pie. But the rest of the pie belongs to the manager or the employer, the boss, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's actually messed up. Like, and I really appreciate that
mm,
you guys are doing a co-op because I think that's the right model. The pie belongs to everybody, not just the boss. And so
Yeah.
yeah.
unions are sort of in this, we're here to rein the boss in. But at what point do the workers ever actually take over the means of production is kind of the question, right? For
Right.
me.
Right.
Um, there's some really good documentary called The Take. I think that Naomi
Oh
Klein
yes.
and they right, workers are totally capable of taking
Yes.
over the factory and just like doing the work. So I
Yeah.
think I and historically universities were actually co-ops,
Hmm.
and I think it's the University of Bologna was a co-op for many, many,
Hmm.
many years. So,
Mm,
like the university model, as it is, like this idea of collegial governance, it actually, like, if it's formulated in a way where the faculty and the students are the members of the co-op, it works a lot better than a corporation, which is
Yes.
unfortunately the pressure that we're seeing today. Like everything's kind of top down,
yeah. Hmm.
corporatized, and that's actually a really culturally dysfunctional model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm really feeling that in my school life, but
Oh, I hear you.
it's
Yeah.
also, that's why exactly why we're a unionized co-op too, so we also have a collective agreement, and also we're all the, and also I mean I will just maybe just quickly mention, I mean what we've been also been trying to think through as well is because even the co-op model, there's faults in it too, in terms of the fact that like we have a board, right? And so we've been, and we haven't figured out the perfect model for it yet, but we've
Mm-hmm.
transferred all of the decision making to the General Assembly, which
Mhm.
means a lot more meetings. But it also
Yeah.
means a lot, that the decisions are not made by a circle that is confidential, for example, and not accountable to the rest of the membership as well.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
But thank you.
That's
I would,
good.
yeah, I've been
Yeah.
thinking about that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like, that's exactly it, like, how do you make your decisions, and how do people have some say in what's happening?
Mm-hmm.
That's basically kinda what it comes down to,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and yeah, good point that, yes, absolutely, co-ops should be unionized too.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we're experiencing too is that people are still coming into whether it's like a union space or co-op space, they're coming in, or a collective even, they're coming into it still playing the role that of an employee, for
Yeah.
example. And it's and even for myself, it's been very difficult to kind of like recalibrate and like reshift my mind in terms of who am I answering to, or do I step into embodying the actual power that I hold as a worker versus just doing what an employee is supposed to do and answering to an employer. So we've been having kind of issues around how do we facilitate that, a healthier model for people to actually step into that role healthily.
Because on the other thing too, I would add to that too, is like we are trying to flatten hierarchies and redistribute, like be really like really interrogate power
Yeah,
and
we
hierarchy
can say that, but we step
under.
into hierarchies constantly, and I,
Yeah.
like for me as when I facilitate, that is so visible and so apparent, that you put a group together and people naturally step into those complex hierarchies, which isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Rita, I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Well, we're all,
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say this idea that we're all equal, like we're all equal in value, but we're not equal in
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Mm.
Yeah.
No, I wanted to make sure that we save some time to talk about all the organizing you've been doing. Can you tell us sort of maybe some of the what are you up to in terms of organizing, and maybe how can people get involved too?
Sure. Yeah. I feel like it's not just me. Like when we say organizing, I think there's a whole bunch of people. So as you may recall, I back in 2018, there was a big rally of about 10,000 people up on Burnaby Mountain. There was a Coast Salish watch house built on the east side of the Trans Mountain Tank Farm. And there was also a camp called Camp Cloud at the entrance of the tank farm. And there was a lot of activity. There have been waves and waves of activities over the years. So in
Mm,
2014, there was a wave of arrests. In 2018, another wave of arrests. And like at different times, people have organized and risen up spontaneously, I would say, in response to the pipeline expansion. And so the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, the Tsleil-Waututh Sacred Trust has done a comprehensive environmental assessment that shows that we cannot afford the risks that this pipeline would do or
mm,
inflict. And the Tsleil-Waututh, just to put it into context, and Lee is actually a granddaughter of Chief Dan George from the
mm,
Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and there are lots of familial relations throughout this area. But the Tsleil-Waututh have been doing a lot of work to heal the land. They're a small nation, about 500 or 600 people, down up from about 13 at their smallest number, like right from the brink of extinction, basically. And they've been gradually healing and building themselves back up. And they have done work to clean the water so that they can harvest clams again. They have done work
Wow.
around restoring salmon habitat and wetlands. They've
mm,
been reintroducing elk into the territory. They're doing amazing work to heal themselves and the land. And all of
mm,
this is endangered by this horrific pipeline expansion. Like,
mm.
even if there's no spill, which I think is unlikely because spills have happened throughout
Yeah.
the history of this pipeline, but even if there was no spill, simply extracting 3 times the amount of bitumen from northern Alberta in the tar sands and burning it is basically going to cook the planet. So we
Mm-hmm.
can't afford it, right? So I can bike,
Yeah.
I can recycle, whatever. It doesn't really matter what I do individually because that scale is so small.
Yeah.
Like, we're
Right.
living in an area that has a huge mass scale project that is like, so obviously me by myself, I can't do much, but there are hundreds of people and maybe thousands of people that are really worried and concerned about this. And
Mm,
so one of the things that COVID made difficult was that sense of gathering, for instance. But the watch house is still there. There was just a rally this past weekend that brought in Indigenous leaders from across North America. And there's a renewed commitment, I would say, to stopping the pipeline. The um, there's a organizing happening at Burnaby Mountain. I'm not one of the main organizers, but I'm so happy to support other people organizing. It's called Hug the Mountain, and
Mm.
folks will be basically hugging Burnaby Mountain and making a point that we have to care for the land.
Mm.
And the Coast Salish Watch House that I've been up supporting for the last 4 years since it was built runs under the law of Natsamat. Natsamat, roughly translated, means one heart, one mind, one spirit, that we're all related, that we're connected. And watch houses were traditionally built to guard against the enemy, to watch for the enemy, which is Trans Mountain in this case, but also
Yes.
to
Mhm.
look after our loved ones. And it's been really hard the last couple of years watching the amount of trees that have been cut down. Like thousands of trees that were there when we were up there in 2018 have been basically clear cut and taken out. And they're expanding the number of tanks from 13 to 28.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
all of the foliage that used to be habitat for birds, like I've seen
Yeah.
flicker feathers, red-tailed hawks, eagles. I've even seen a bobcat up there once a long time ago. There was a
Wow.
bear that hung around the mountain. All of that is just being decimated, basically. It's turning into this barren wasteland. And so I think this is where maybe art also has a place to play because, so we have these tanks. How could we repurpose them? What else could you put in a bunch of tanks besides bitumen and toxic shit?
Mm.
Like maybe you could turn it into an anaerobic digester and take food waste and turn it into energy. Like there's other
Right.
things that could be done with those tanks, basically. And I
Mm.
am not the technical person to tell you what that would be, but I am the person to say we need to imagine better and we need to imagine differently, and it's urgent that we do so.
Mm.
So folks continue to uh, rally, as I mentioned, to basically try to stop work. There's an injunction that involves people. If you're arrested, as I was, you can face up to a month of jail time for just basically blocking a truck for, like, I don't know, half an hour or something.
Mm.
And then at the same time, last year there were nesting hummingbirds around the Brunette River watershed where they were trying to cut down trees, and those little hummingbirds stopped the logging for about 4 months. So people who are, because
Oh.
of environmental laws that have to protect nesting birds,
Yeah.
but then after the nesting happened, then or they came in and cut it down, so those birds don't have a place to go this year,
Mm.
right? And so
Wow.
people have been up in trees. People have been just basically blocking trucks. There was an 80-year-old woman, Catherine Hembling, who spent her 80th birthday in jail for blocking a Trans Mountain clear cutting. Like all of this is still going on. It's not being covered by the corporate media, I would say, anywhere near how it should be.
Mm.
But there's a sense that through a combination of divestment, there's also been attempts to divest from the to tell the insurance insurers of the pipeline to divest and to not insure this pipeline. And people in insurance, I think, should understand and do understand the real. They're not just risks now; they're
Yeah.
probabilities and probably certainties at this point that more climate instability is coming.
Yeah.
So I remember being at a fundraiser once where David Suzuki was like, "We're like that coyote that's chasing the roadrunner, and we've fallen
Yeah.
off the cliff. Like the roadrunner is able to stop, but the coyote can't because it's too big and dumb, and it just keeps falling off the cliff." But how
Yeah.
far we fall off the cliff, whether it's 2 inches or 2 miles or 200,000 meters, that still matters, right?
Yeah.
So, like
Right.
stopping the pipeline, stopping these really destructive projects, stopping clear cut of old growth, all of that is like really important to do.
Yeah.
So, if folks want to get involved, they can check out stoptmx.ca.
Mm.
Those are some of the folks who've been basically up in the trees. And not everybody, I'm not athletic, I won't be up in the tree, but I do. There is a need to support folks who are willing and able to do that work. So, I helped facilitate an art exhibit in the trees last
Yeah.
year, for instance,
Oh,
and
cool. Wow.
brought food and, stuff like that. So there's ways in which we all can do different things to contribute. So like whether it's divestment, not ensuring civil disobedience, reiterating again and again that it's Indigenous law that we need to be abiding by. And Indigenous law has not given consent. Indigenous law involves a responsibility to protect these lands and waters, which the federal government is failing to do. So whether we're talking about just reiterating the importance of decolonizing and upholding Indigenous laws, and also just stopping the work. I feel. Oh, and the third thing is nature itself. Like the floods stopped the pipeline construction for many weeks last year, or actually maybe it was this year in January, whenever it was.
Yeah.
And, so I feel like the economy is sort of always being framed as if it's the most important thing, but actually it's not the most powerful actor on this planet.
No,
That's the
nature
earth
is.
itself.
Yeah.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so the more connected we can stay to nature, the more we work with nature, like whether it's paying attention to little hummingbirds or floods or fires or heat waves, and amplifying the messages that the land is already telling us loud and clear, so I feel like we're basically aligned with the earth, and that we have to remind people to align themselves with the earth and to
Right.
basically resist this kind of colonial um,
Pressure?
dysfunction.
Dysfunction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think of it as a form of insanity, like this
Yeah, well
disconnection.
said.
Yeah.
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 And on that note, that's just a perfect way of ending. We want to end with our favorite question that is the most consistent throughout each episode of Hot Pot Talks, which is, Rita, what is your favorite hot pot ingredient or
Oh.
experience?
Before I answer that question, can I say one more thing?
Yes,
Yes, please.
And it's just that when we care about the lands where we live and the watersheds, we also have to care about the ones that are far away. So I've also spent time up in the north around the Salish Sea Dam, and I'm connected to that watershed just through the very electricity that's bringing us together. About a third of the energy we use in BC is from the previous dams on the Peace River, and so my hope is that we don't repeat the violence of the past and that we find a way to stop that from happening again. And there's a really important court case with the Blueberry River First Nations up in the Northeast in the Peace region that people should be aware of, because it says that cumulative effects have been too much, and BC has breached its treaty responsibilities. So they basically Blueberry now is in a position where if anything else happens on their land, they have the right to say no to it
Right.
and have it backed up by the province. So
Wow.
it's I think a game changer. It's very early days yet, but I would keep an eye out for that. And then in terms of my favorite ingredient, I would say the broth. It's got to be the water, right?
It's got to be the water. I love this. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect, and no one said that.
No one's ever said the broth.
Do you have a favorite broth?
Oh, I love it at the end, because
Yeah.
all the flavors built
Absorbed in
more.
there.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
so
Yes.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rita. It was so nice to have you on Hot Pot Talks.
Thank you for having me. Love talking with you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rita, and we'll see you at the next episode.